Okay, so mannerism, we were talking about, this is the first period that we've talked about that was defined by us as historians rather than them as artists. It was a term that didn't come up until the 1920s, when art historians looked back at mid-16th century Italian art and saw that it was significantly more strange than high Renaissance art had been. It doesn't have the same sense of balance and perfect proportion and overall harmony that we had seen in the high Renaissance. So the stability that we got used to with Raphael and Leonardo is gone. Figures teeter around a bit. They're in uncomfortable poses. The anatomy of various figures doesn't fit together. Colors are jarring and kind of unnatural. Hot pinks and acid greens, bright blues, right? These things are different from the sorts of harmonious colors that we gotten used to in Renaissance Italian pictures. In addition to that, the spatial clarity is not as clean. Things are much more crowded and busy. These are all hallmarks of mannerism. And again, it's not like Del Sarto or Bronzino thought that they were mannerist artists. They thought they were kind of continuing the trend of Renaissance art by looking back at Raphael, by looking back at Leonardo. Look at that arm of Father Time, very much like Leonardo's figures, right? Yeah, Tracy.
The titles are switched, right?
Yes, they are. Oops, my bad. You're absolutely right. Points for Tracy, right? This is Bronzino on the left and Del Sarto on the right. Thank you very much. I had tried to flip, I made some last minute changes and screwed it up. Yeah, so, right, thank you. Now, where was I? Spaces are crowded, figures are sort of stuffed in to the point where some of them just don't even work anatomically, whether it's the snake lion woman behind Cupid in the image on the left, on the right-hand side, or behind Folly, or Cupid himself, whose neck and shoulder and buttocks just don't seem to work together. But what we do see is an interest in sort of, I don't want to say, beauty for its own sake. Like you get the sense that Bronzino over here is really kind of interested in the curve of that leg, you know, and the sort of the beauty of that ivory skin, you know, for its own sake, the sort of artificial beauty. And these are all the reasons we call them mannerist, right? Is exactly for these elements: the heightened color pitch, the uncomfortable poses, the awkward anatomies, the crowded spaces. These are all hallmarks of mannerism, which becomes the dominant art style in the 16th century. So at the end of class a while back, we had seen that these were both painted for the King of France. So even though they're Italian works of art, they're being made for export to King Francis I of France. And he's been a kind of a regular suspect in what we've been talking about. He's appeared a great number of times in class. He bought parts of Julius's tomb when Michelangelo didn't finish it, right? He bought Leonardo, who took with him the Mona Lisa and worked for Francis I during his last years in France, right? He's a big collector of Italian Renaissance art, Italian 16th century art. And in many ways, what happens under Francis I is that mannerism becomes sort of the official style of the French court. Because in addition to having works of art that he's purchasing from artists who are living in Florence, in Italy, he also brings artists from Florence up to France to work for him. So we talked about Leonardo already. He got there, 1515 or so, lived there till his death in 1519, and then around 1530, Francis hires two more Italian artists, Rosso Fiorentino, the redhead of Florence. That's what his name means. Nice, huh? Rosso, red. Fiorentino of Florence and Francesco Primaticcio come to decorate his palace at Fontainebleau, which is 30, 40 miles outside of Paris, and was originally the site of a hunting lodge. And I think Francis still looks at it as a kind of a hunting lodge, but it's more like a pleasure palace, right? And so he has a number of architects rebuild it from ground up, right? And these Italian artists come to decorate it. So Primaticcio does these stucco figures on the side, and you'll notice again the lack of balance. Look at that satyr figure on your right, the half human, half goat in stucco, in sculpture. And you'll notice that it doesn't really want to balance on that little stand, that little plinth he's given it. It's sort of teetering off. And the painting in the middle that this frames is by Rosso Fiorentino, and it's got that typical Mannerist jumble. Just a total sort of cacophony of figures that also are displaying nudity as a form of sort of elegance. Classic Mannerist art being made now for the King of France. And at the end of class, we were looking then at this print that we have at the National Gallery after that painting. Francis commissioned a number of artists to make souvenirs for visitors to Fontainebleau. You know, we buy postcards, right? Posters and whatnot at the National Gallery. If you go down there, a scarf or an umbrella or whatever. He had prints that he would give to people or sell to people that reproduced the different paintings that one saw when they visited Fontainebleau. And so here, the Conquest of Ignorance we see in this print after Rosso's composition, where it makes it a little bit clearer because it's larger and it's a better photo, right? But we can see these Mannerist crowding. Now, we can't really talk about Mannerist color here because it's an engraving, right? But if we look at the anatomies, we see that they're kind of artificial in a way, whether it's this kneeling figure over here with his head between his knees, it looks like mashed potatoes, right, across his back over here. Or this figure on the far side getting Harvey Weinstein. You can say that now, right? If you're following the news, right? Getting groped here, hand on the buttock there, and then this long, elegant leg coming down over here, right? It's just all muddled together, but you get the sense that Rosso's original design and the print after it are focusing on these sort of elegant body parts, independent from a sense of harmony, stability, unity in organization that was more typical of the Renaissance, right? So this again remains for us this style term, right? Mannerism, which appealed to people at court, right? Skip there. This is why I meant to change things around and I didn't finish editing my PowerPoint. So there we are. The other thing about Mannerism that we see is also a sense of confusion when it comes to the subject matter. They become increasingly more erudite. There's a big word for, right, complicated, complex, erudite, learned, to the point where they sometimes are very difficult to read. And in fact, to this day, people who study 16th century art look at the palace at Fontainebleau, and some of these things we have no idea what the subject matter is. They're just that confusing, right? So, our print after this painting, again, high Mannerism. Now we have one last group of Mannerists to look at, and those are the artists that are working in Venice. And we're just going to look at, I think, 2 different pictures is all from the Venetian Mannerists, where again, if we think about Mannerism as a term that defines this newer style in 16th century art, a style that is dominated by confusion, busyness, crowdedness, artificial color combinations, a lack of balance. With Tintoretto's work showing the conversion of Saul, I think we can see this. Almost to the point where Saul gets lost in the jumble. Now, does anybody know the story of the conversion of Saul? Who was Saul? No? Does anybody? Allie? I can't remember what he did for a living. No, he was a persecutor of Christians. right? But he became Paul, right? He converted after seeing a blinding light from heaven, fell off his horse on the way to Damascus, on the road to Damascus, right? Sees a blinding light from heaven, falls from his horse, and converts from being one of the most vicious persecutors of Christians to becoming the man responsible for writing most of the New Testament, right? Most of the Christian Bible are Paul's letters to the different churches, right? So Saul of Tarsus becomes the Apostle Paul, right? Now, he's not one of the 12 disciples because he didn't follow Christ that way. He only converted after Christ was dead. So we see now the moment when he's knocked off his horse. And Tintoretto has taken some liberties with the Bible. In the Bible, it mentions that this is a quiet scene. But Tintoretto makes it incredibly noisy. So we see Jesus in the upper left corner, God, in pink and blue, again, surrounded by yellow. Talk about a bright, sort of hot color combo. Sweeping in, the light casting down, and there's Paul, or Saul, being struck blind in the center bottom. His shield has been dropped, his helmet has been dropped, and you'll notice that that pose is very sort of awkward as well. He's sort of splayed out on the ground. It kind of makes sense for the scene, but it is a mannerist pose, right? And as this happens, right, Tintoretto imagines it as being this thunderclap of noise, upsetting everything. Because the Bible says nobody else noticed anything. And that's not how Tintoretto does it. So it's this jumble of figures. And it's almost dominated by this guy on the left who's riding off on a horse. And if you look at his body, notice how amplified the musculature is under that yellow plate of armor, right? And how really the leg that's on the back seems almost like it just kind of disappears on us, right? If you look at his right hip over here, right? Here's one leg coming in, the other leg goes back over here, but it doesn't quite really work. And the way he's contorted and twisted, and the way the figures are crowded in tightly together, horses rearing everywhere, and people struggling to keep them in rein. But look at the color choices for all these parts. Hot oranges, reds and greens, hot pinks down below. This is all mannerism and how they're all so crowded together that it becomes difficult to read with one quick view. If we think about Leonardo, right, or Michelangelo for that matter, when we looked at their pictures, when we looked at their paintings, you could get everything, the big picture, with a pretty quick glance because it was so well organized. But with this, the more you look at it, the more you find there's more busy things going on. Kind of every single part of it is covered up with some sort of visual noise, some sort of movement or action. Primarily in this case with these horses that we see everywhere. Upper right corner, a man looking like he's pushing those horses up over that bridge. Lower right corner, a horse dumping his riders into the water. More horses going up on a diagonal behind. It's just an utter jumble of figures. And this is, again, mannerism in a nutshell, right? So again, mannerist elements, crowding, busyness, right? Space being strange, being often compressed. We certainly have that here as well, right? How do you read the space in this? How does that mountain that tips up on the left orchestrate with the view through to the distance on the right? How does that bridge work with the water flowing underneath it? Again, these things just don't make immediate sense. They don't have the sense of harmony that was typical of the Renaissance. Now, the most famous artist to come through Venice during this Mannerist period is El Greco. Who's working on this, right? So here's your picture, right? Again. This was painted after El Greco had moved through Venice. But El Greco came from Venice. His name means the Greek, right? Domenicos Theotokopoulos, right? There's a lot of syllables in there. You can never get it straight, right? And he actually signs down below on the head of the line with his Greek initial, DT. But he moves from Crete, the island of Crete. That's why it's called El Greco. the Venetian Republic, part of the Venetian Empire. Right? So he comes to the capital of Venice to train how to paint. Right? He started painting in Crete, comes to Venice, he studies under Titian for a little while, and then he studies under Tintoretto. And after spending some time in Venice, particularly picking up ideas, Tintoretto seems to be this major influence on him, although Titian as well. He moves to Spain, to the town of Toledo in Spain, Toledo, Spain, and spends most of his career from around the 1580s on in the city of Toledo, in Spain. And that's where this was painted. This was part of a couple of paintings for a chapel in Toledo, right? And it shows the Virgin Mary up above. She's in heaven, surrounded by angels, got baby Jesus on her lap, and down below the two saints from the title, St. Agnes on the right. Agnes means lamb in Latin, so she always appears holding a lamb. And Martina on the left. I don't know as much about St. Martina, but she obviously was a martyr because she carries a palm over her shoulder, which is the sign of martyrdom. This is martyr, yeah. Martyr means killed for her faith. M-A-R-T-Y-R, martyrdom. Right? And I imagine that the lion that we see down below her hand is probably her symbol. Like I said, I know less about her. Right? But the other painting that went with this was a St. Martin. Right? And we have both of them at the National Gallery, which is kind of nice. And they probably sat on either side of the altar in this chapel. Right? You're nodding so you might know all this, right? Please, God, let this come up on the midterm, right? It's a gimme to you if it does, right? Now, what's Mannerist about this? Quite a few things, really. And some things that are absolutely particular for El Greco. Color combos, right? Mannerism has these strange, artificial color combinations. Look at the angel in the upper left corner. It's a gorgeous green. But notice how El Greco puts it immediately next to that sort of fiery pink. Right? That's particularly Mannerist. Down below, that hot red of St. Agnes, made even hotter by the overall blue tonality of the work, which is kind of a hallmark for El Greco. A lot of his works are very blue in tonality. But that's kind of artificial to make everything sort of one tone. So there's our detail of the angel in the upper left. Because he studied under Titian, one of the things we see in his works is the same interest in that unblended application of paint. Remember when we looked at Titian, we talked about the fact that he doesn't tend to take the paint and sort of blend away the signs that he had actually laid down paint in strokes. Leaves the strokes apparent. El Greco does that even more so. Look at the highlights in that green robe, or the white highlights of the Virgin's sleeve, or the hair of the angel. You can almost imagine him painting that onto the surface. Yeah.
Do the colors have the same symbolism as they did in the early Renaissance?
They do, definitely. So the blue and the red. In this case, it's kind of gone pink on us, right? And part of the reason it's pink is one of the things that El Greco does. A couple of things are particular for El Greco. It's just El Greco, right? More than the others. His particular anatomical strangeness is everything was stretched. Look at the figure in the lower left corner. Doesn't everything look like it's been pulled bottom to top, attenuated, stretched, and thinner? So faces look longer, right? Bodies look elongated. The hand of the Virgin has this sort of lovely, elongated, elegant fingers. That's one thing. Now, I'm going to get back to your question. The other thing is he loves to highlight with white. So is it looking like it's been lit with a strobe light or lightning? There's just a flashiness to the highlights. So if we look at the Virgin's robe, right? Look at all those shots of white that look like lightning bolts coming out across the highlights. And in this case now, back to the color symbolism question, the pink on her sleeve is really, it's red, but it's been highlighted with white. And that makes it then appear pink. So yes, the same color combos are there. So the blue is the color of faithfulness, right? Red, her suffering. The white around her head, the veil, her purity, right? Are all still very much in play here. Other mannerist elements. So we've got anatomical distortion. Got strange color combos. What else could we talk about? Space is flattened out. There's no sort of foreground and background. Everything's sort of squashed up close to the surface. Very artificial. That's what mannerism means, an artificial kind of art. Balance. What's the Virgin sitting on, standing on? You'll notice how the composition comes to a point at her feet, and those two little angels down below struggling to hold her up. But she looks kind of like a spinning top, you know? That could knock over at any point. And then if we look at Jesus on her lap, right, holding her finger, and again, that's going back to your question, the same question. He's holding her finger again. Back to Giotto. One of the first things we saw in class was that holding of the fingers, a tender mother-child moment. But I don't want to look at that so much as he's fallen off her lap. He's like sliding because she's neither seated nor standing. You know, she's sort of in between. And there's not really a lap there for Jesus to comfortably sit on. And so he seems almost like he's sliding off. Now, it works together, it holds together as a composition, but that imbalance, right, is a hallmark of mannerist art. Look at his arm, too, right? How strange the anatomy and the bone structure of that arm is. Those sort of curves, this, right? The way that bone works, the way it bends in his forearm, the pair of bones, right? It's something that Raphael or Michelangelo would never have let happen, right? It's, again, style over substance, this hallmark of mannerism, right? There's St. Martina in the lower left corner. Again, we can see how loose the paint is applied with those angels down below. But also El Greco's a tendency to stretch things. Stretch bodies, stretch arms, stretch fingers, stretch faces. And down below, the Greek letters DT, Domenicos Theotokopoulos, on the lion's head. Probably because the lion was also the symbol of St. Mark. No, that wouldn't work then. Never mind. I went off on a tangent and it doesn't lead anywhere, right? I was thinking that it was the symbol of the painter's patron, but it's not, right? So forget that line. Notice again how he highlights with white, how again he leaves everywhere on the robe the sense of the paint having just been applied in these very thick scumbles, right? That's typical for him. Yeah.
That when they like avoiding to be like the hands, torches, not like saying like hands, or they became like taller. They do it in a purpose to not be realism.
Well,
or they don't know that professionally like that.
I think El Greco knows exactly what he's doing. I don't think he's doing it. I think that at a certain point no one sat down and said why. It's a good question to ask why, but no one ever said why. It's just something that we've noticed, and it went kind of without notice for many, many years. One of the things that we think is that, for one, the majority of the artists that are working in mannerism are working for one of the major European courts. And the elegance of mannerism had a certain appeal at court. It looks expensive, it looks elegant. It's more decorative. People liked it for that. So that's one thing we think. With El Greco, something else is coming into play, which is he's very, very late. You'll notice this is the newest work of art we've seen. It's almost 1600, right? We're almost to the 17th century here. And by the end of the 16th century, there's another thing that comes into play. And that is that the Catholic Church has made a proclamation about how art should look. Okay? And this had everything to do with, okay, I'll write a few things up on the board here, right? In 1517, Martin Luther began the Reformation. Okay? Martin Luther, Lutherans, right, had 95 issues that he had with the church. So he goes to the church in Wittenberg, right, nails these 95 arguments to the door of the church in Wittenberg, right, challenges the cardinal of Brandenburg, the cardinal of that region, to a debate. The central issue that he doesn't like is this idea called indulgences. They had a lot more beef than that, right? But the idea of indulgences is that your good works help to expiate your sins. That's under Old Catholic theology. Your good works would forgive your sins. Right? Now, what happens if you don't have that many sins, but a lot of good works? You got more than you need. So what happened is people started selling them. You have some of mine. Right? I guess it's kind of like what do we call this carbon? This thing in energy in ecology. We talk about things where you get carbon points and you can sell them to someone else. You know. Same idea, and that's what pissed Luther off. Sorry, got him upset. Right? Was the idea of selling them, and Luther's idea was that salvation came from faith, not from good works. It's in your heart, not what you do, not the external stuff, but what happens inside. Right? So that was kind of the cornerstone of that, was this idea of selling indulgences. Was really at the heart of the issue. But it's not the only thing that he was upset about. And so his attempt to reform the church, right, led to the break of Protestants versus Catholics. So prior to 1517, we really just have various forms of Catholicism. There might be the Eastern Orthodox Church, the Byzantine Church, and the Western Church, but there were no Protestants yet. So we can't really talk about Catholicism yet. Does that make sense? Right? So with the Reformations, we get the split between the Prots and the Catholics, right? Okay? Now, what does the church do? Nothing. They hope it'll just go away. They hope it'll blow over. Up until 1542, when it became clear that Protestantism had taken off everywhere, especially in Northern Europe, especially in Germany, in the Low Countries, right? Really taken off. Parts of France. So in 1542, the church finally decides, 25 years later, right? Finally decides it's time we should address this issue of what did Martin Luther. And so they convene a council, a church council in the city of Trento, Council of Trent. And this is going to be a huge series of meetings where the church, the Catholic Church now, will decide what it stands for, what are its theological points, and begin to sort of address some of the criticisms that were coming out of the Protestants. Now, this is not something that happens overnight. There were 3 meetings that lasted all the way to the 1560s. Over 20 years of meetings at the Council of Trent. 3 major conventions in between which people got together to sort of hash it all out. Okay? At the last Council of Trent, I can't remember exactly when in the 60s, I want to say 1564, but don't quote me on that. Okay? Suffice to say in the 1560s, at the 3rd Council of Trent, they decided what art should do. Because the Protestants, as they broke away from Catholicism, started to look at the Bible more literally, and they looked back at the 10 Commandments, and the 2nd commandment says, "Thou shalt make no graven images, no carved images, not of things on the land, beneath the sea, or in the air." No, basically no images. And they took the carved to mean anything, right? Drawn, painted, carved. So in Protestant countries, as Protestantism took off, we start to see people destroying images and questioning their use. So in the 3rd Council of Trent, this is all answering your question, right? At the 3rd Council of Trent, they say, no, art is important. Because a lot of people can't read. And art is the Bible of the illiterate. Right? It's important as a teaching tool. So we can't get rid of it. And this goes back to what a pope had said around 600 AD. Pope Gregory the Great had said this as well. Right? Art has an outreach factor. Right? So the church decides in the Third Council of Trent, art's good. We want art. Not like the Protestants. Right? And we want art as a way of teaching. And as they did this, they said, this is what art should look like. And one of the things they said is dramatic. It should be dramatic, because that way it reaches out and grabs the viewer. So, some of what El Greco is doing with these elongated bodies is that it becomes more dramatic as well. Okay? So, with earlier art, like Andrea del Sarto or Bronzino, that doesn't really enter into it. It only applies to religious art, right? And we'll see as we move into the 17th century, it has a huge impact on other artists as well, because they said three basic things, and the idea of drama is just one of them. We'll talk about the other ones later, right? Because they just confuse the issue at this point. Okay? So that's a long answer, but it's an important one, because it's important to keep in mind what's going on at this time. And will lead us now as we move to Northern Europe, because we're now going to move into Germany and look at the kind of art that's being done during this time, right? During the time of the Reformation, right? So I'll have time to come back to that, okay? So, in Germany, we're moving to Germany. We're going to talk a lot about Albrecht Dürer. I love Albrecht Dürer. I think he's fantastic. He was a painter and a printmaker. We're only going to look at his prints. In this case, he's making engravings. We've talked about engravings before, right? Remember the Battle of the 10 Nude Men by Polaiuolo, by a vowel, right? Polaiuolo, where you cut the lines into a plate, a metal plate. You rub ink into the cut lines and polish off the flat bits, and then you press a piece of paper on it, removing the ink, and then you can do it again. You can make multiples from the same matrix. So on the left, from an 18th century encyclopedia on how you make an engraving, those are our points. Dürer is maybe, I don't even want to say maybe, I think for my money, the best engraver that ever put a burin to the metal. Absolutely fantastic. Better than Polaiuolo by a long shot, and he knows it. And we'll see as we look at details of the fall of man exactly what we're talking about. Now, it makes a nice comparison. First, let's talk about how he achieves tone. When we looked at Polaiuolo, we saw that when Polaiuolo makes shades of gray, from light gray to dark gray, the lines get closer together and deeper. But for the most part, his lines are all diagonal, one direction, right? Dürer varies his lines significantly more, where they follow the contour of the body, where they do what we call cross-hatch, right? They come one direction and then cut over the other direction. And it's absolutely fantastic when you dive into these things, and how good an engraver he is. So as he does the muscles of his abdominals, right, you can see those lines following and tracing the different muscles around. Or Adam's left, his proper left pectoral, right, on your right. How the lines form this network of cross-hatching. And sometimes he'll come back and even just put little dots in it. Tick, 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 right? To give us more tone. There's this amazing range. Some of them are lines that describe hair, like a little tuft in between his pectorals. But most of the time, they are modeling the surface, right, in this range of tones. And this, like Polaiuolo, they'll get darker by getting deeper, by getting closer together. But the other thing that Dürer does is he brings these layers of crosshatch over the top, right? One going one direction, one going another, and sometimes even a third as well. Looking into the background behind Adam's shoulder, we can see the degree to which that crosshatch just overlays and overlays and overlays until we get the darkest dark in the upper right corner of this detail beneath Adam's chin. Right? Now, one might imagine looking at this that Dürer is in fact very much like other Northern European artists that we looked at before. So remember in the 15th century when we talked about the Renaissance, we talked about the fact that Italy was all into perspective and rationality and these perfect bodies based on Greek and Roman statues, right? Whereas up north, Jan van Eyck, right? Artists were much more interested in exquisitely rendered details, like perfect and microscopic. Well, Dürer is like that, even though the bodies are quite obviously also Greco-Roman. He melds the two together. I want to look at the details first, and then we'll talk about the body types, right? Dürer is fantastic when it comes to rendering detail in amazingly tight, sharp focus. Here's a watercolor painting from the National Gallery, right? Wow. Just a tuft of grass that he's brought into the studio to render. This is in opaque watercolors, in gouache. But you can see that he's interested in every microfilament of every leaf, right? Every seed within each of the flowers that are opening. And as we look at the fall of man, this is not a preparatory study for anything. He's just drawing. But if we look at the fall of man, we also see the fact that he is just as detailed here. That as he's engraving nature, we see an amazing amount of detail, right? At the same time, with Dürer, he brings Italian body types in. Whenever we looked at Northern art, whether it was Roger van der Weyden or Jan van Eyck, right? Robert Campan we saw online, they didn't use Italian body types. They didn't use these old Roman muscle men and women. But Dürer does. And he's the first Northern artist to really adopt the whole idea of the Renaissance. Right? The Renaissance being a revival of ancient Rome. Right? With Van Eyck, we didn't see that. Right? It's called late Gothic for that reason. But with Dürer, we can talk about a Renaissance because he too is interested in ancient Roman types. And in fact, by 1504, he'd already been to Italy. He went in 1496. He's going to go again in 1506. He's very interested in Italian art. He's very interested in Italian artists. He goes to meet Bellini, whose Feast of the Gods we saw last week. Right? Says, man is as old as the hills, but there's nobody better as a painter anywhere. Right? So he spends some time in Venice, visiting artists there. He writes in his journals that, up north, we're still craftsmen. Down here, they know how to treat artists as intellectuals. Right? So he's bringing Italian body types, Roman body types, into this northern interest in exquisite detailing. And he includes with this all of these incredibly well-rendered vegetation and animals in the print, right? And on a certain level, I think he's showing off. He is intending this to tell people how good he is. And we see something that we saw with Pollaiuolo as well. He signs it with his name and where he lives. Alberto Dürer Noricus of Nuremberg. Faciebat, that's Latin for made this, right? Latin, learned. Lower left corner, AD, his monogram, the A making the little house over the D, Albrecht Dürer, and the date. Now with Pollaiuolo's 10 nude men, remember it said Antonio Pollaiuolo of Florence, meant as a way of publicizing his skill, right? I think that's exactly what Dürer's doing here as well, publicizing his skill, right? And hanging it, he loves to do this, putting it on a little tablet that's hanging in the composition. We also see there a parrot on the branch that Adam is holding on to, and we see a bunch of other animals as well. What do you see here? What other animals are there?
Rabbit.
Got a rabbit down there behind Eve's leg. Let somebody else, others. What else? We got a rabbit, we got a parrot.
Snake.
The snake, which we should expect to see, right? That's a given. The snake, and you'll notice that Eve is in the process of taking an apple from the snake, but she's already taken one from the snake as well. She has another one behind her hip, right? So she's taking the second apple from the snake. What else do we see here other than those two?
Is that a deer?
There's a deer, right, or something back there. It's probably it's hard to say, an elk or maybe a moose, right, or a European elk. Good. What else do we have? The cat. What's next to the cat? There's a tiny little mouse down there too, right? And then behind Eve on the far right, an oxen or a cow, right? Kneeling down, laying down. Any other ones? There's something up there in the upper right corner, a billy goat on the top of the hill, rendered very small. Now this overall print is about like this, right? So all these details that we're talking about are in fact quite small. Let's take a look at these, right? Why does Dürer include these animals? There's the cat and the mouse. Isn't that funny, right? Notice that the cat's asleep, right? And also notice that the mouse is trapped under Adam's foot, right? In fact, it wants to get away, but it's pulling at his tail, and tail is like tight, right? Now, notice what Adam's doing, right? He's leaning toward Eve. Now, he's got contrapposto pose and whatnot, but he's leaning over toward Eve because she's already got an apple. She's already bit it. Now she's getting Adam to join her. That's the story, right? And Eve does it. It's always women's fault, right? Eve does it first, and then she gets Adam to, hey, it's all right, you know? Nothing happened after disobeying God, right? So she's got her apple back here, and she's getting the second one to give to Adam, and Adam can't wait because his hand, he's already fallen for it, right? He's already listened to her, so his hand is there's an apple spaced void in his hand, right? He's ready to take it, and so he's leaning over to Eve to take. And as he does, he's taking all the weight off of his right leg. And in a second, as he takes the apple, that leg comes up, mouse goes out, the cat wakes up, all hell breaks loose. Right? Dürer intends this as a metaphor. This is the moment before the fall. This is the moment before sin disrupts the harmony of Eden. And he uses that cat and the mouse as a metaphor for what's going to happen next. The problems that Adam doesn't understand he's getting himself into. Now, others have argued that the animals are there because one of the things that Adam had to do, Adam's only work in the Garden of Eden. He didn't have to work, right? It was a cush job, right? He and Eve were plunked down in the Garden of Eden. He had one job to do: name the animals. That was it. And in many ways, through the Middle Ages, people interpreted Adam and Eve as the story of, like, before the sin, they're like land barons, like counts and nobles. And after the fall, God says you got to go to work. Right? They move from the state of grace to a state of sinfulness, and their punishment is work, like the peasants. Right? So people use this to underscore feudalism as a mindset. Well, here's the moment when it changes, right? From the state of grace God's original dispensation of grace to the fall. And that idea that Adam doesn't understand the problems he's about to get into also accounts for the billy goat. Staring down over the cliff, well up above the birds, right? He also, I mean, he's sure-footed, so he's not going to fall. But at the same time, he doesn't recognize the danger of standing on the edge of a cliff. My wife does it to me. She knows I'm terrified of heights. So she loves to go walk on the edge of things just to drive me crazy, right? Because she's very sure-footed and she's not scared of heights. Well, I am, and the billy goat should be, and Adam should be as well. He's standing on the edge, right? He's right on the precipice. Now, what about those other animals? We've accounted for the cat and the mouse. We've accounted for the billy goat. What about that bunny rabbit, that elk, the oxen in the background? Well, we know that Durer is interested in his intellectual capacity. He talked about the fact that the artists in Italy were respected as intellectuals, and up here they were not. We know that his hometown of Nuremberg was a hotbed of humanist learning. And the standard interpretation of these animals is that they relate to ideas about medicine that go all the way back to ancient Greece. Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath you've heard, right? He was 5th century BC, Athens, a physician. And one of the things that Hippocrates said was that health came from a balance of the 4 fluids in your body, the 4 primary fluids, right? Blood, gall, phlegm, and what's the last one? I should know this off the top of my head, and I don't. Blood, gall, phlegm, and bile. And if these things are in harmony, you're in harmony, right? You're in health, right? The 4 humors, the 4 fluids. And through the Middle Ages, and even into the Renaissance, this influenced medical practice. This is why you would bleed somebody if they were unhealthy. You're trying to put the fluids back in balance, right? So it's an approach that Durer would have been very, very familiar with, this idea of the 4 humors. And medieval theologians, looking back at Hippocrates, said that, well, you know what? Everything was in harmony in the Garden of Eden. And things went out of harmony after that. And that's our theme anyway with the cat and the mouse, the idea of the coming lack of harmony. So it's altogether likely that each of these animals may reflect the idea of these humors, these 4 fluids of the body. Because each of them were believed to determine a particular character trait in you if you were out of balance. So, for example, what is it? I gotta look down now, right? Too much bile makes you choleric and makes you angry, hot-headed, having too much bile. Cats are often a symbol for being hot-headed. We talk about cat fights, right? Ooh, right? We say when someone says something nasty, right? A cat is a symbol of that, but again, it's its sleep, right? So it's not out of whack yet. The sanguine temperament, someone who's overly happy, comes from having too much blood. Blood is related to a sanguine temperament. And our little bunny rabbit in the background here, happy little hoppy bunny, as a symbol of the sanguine, overly happy temperament. Right? Having too much phlegm, phlegmatic, made you lazy. And our oxen that is kneeling down is a beast of burden who isn't working. Laziness. The most dreaded of all of the diseases, of all of the temperaments, was melancholia, sadness, loneliness. And if you had too much gall, you were melancholic. Our elk in the background, sort of lurking behind that tree, looking warily out at you, the viewer, is often suggested deep in the darkness to be a symbol for melancholia, right, for sadness. Yeah.
What did you call that animal?
An elk, E-L-K. I don't know what you would call it in Spanish, but it's a very large, from the deer family, but significant, like about the size of a horse, right? Right. So there's symbolisms going on with the different animals that Dürer has chosen, right, to include here. Not only do they relate to Adam's job of naming the animals, but on the other hand, they also relate to a sort of sense of perfection and harmony of the four humors all being present in the Garden of Eden, and at the moment before the fall, sort of in balance, in harmony, here together. Now, as I wrote up on the board, right, this is the era of the Reformation. It's a little bit before yet. Dürer in 1504 is still the better part of 15 years before the Reformation. But here's Martin Luther on the left in a print made by Lucas Cranach, slightly after the beginning of the Reformation in 1517. It's just important to remember that this is going on because during the Reformation in Germany, we find a spike in humanist learning and humanist education. And in fact, after the Reformation, after 1517, Dürer became a very devout Protestant. Right? He's not one yet, but he will be one. And some people have looked at some of his late images and seen sort of Protestant overtones in them. He's also friends with almost all of the Protestant humanist thinkers. Here is a portrait he made of Erasmus of Rotterdam, one of the great satirists of Germany in the 16th century, busy working at his desk, and again signed by Dürer with his monogram in the background. Now we'll look at one other work by Dürer in some depth. Not everything was deeply humanist and deeply Renaissance that came out of Dürer's shop. Some of his works are very superstitious, very medieval in their religiosity. Here we see a scene of the end of time, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, coming to destroy the entire world at the end of time as told in the book of Revelation. And this is a different kind of print. This is not an engraving. This is a woodcut. Now, who knows the difference? Does anybody know the difference between an engraving and a woodcut, how they're made? Yes, no?
I think the tools.
They're very different. Well, obviously one is metal. An engraving is done in metal, and a woodcut's done with wood. But the process is entirely different. So remember that with an engraving, you carve the lines, right? And you leave the plate flat, and you rub ink into the lines, and then you polish off the flat bits, right? With a woodcut, you carve the whites, and you roll the ink over the top, and it sits on the parts that you didn't carve. Does that make sense? So, right, with an engraving, if this is your engraving plate, you cut lines into it, right, and then you rub ink into those lines, put a piece of paper over the top, and you push it so it pulls the ink out of those holes, okay? With a woodcut, right, art picker, you just roll the ink on the top and it sits up here. On the tops of the plateaus, you put a piece of paper down, and you just rub it with the heel of your hand, and the print comes off of the line. So if we look at the four horsemen, all the whites you see are carved away. Yeah, wow, right? And all of the darks that you see are the lines that he left upraised. Okay? It's pretty phenomenal as a technician, and we shouldn't expect any less from Dürer from what we've seen. Just to give you a sense of this, this is a wood block that was only partially carved from later in the century that's up in the Metropolitan Museum, where you can see they've done the drawing, or artists have done the drawing on the wood block and started to carve it away, right? To carve away so you leave the lines. You're carving only the negative space. You're carving only the whites. And there you can see it a little bit better, right? So to leave the lines, our wood carver has carved these, right? This wood block, it no longer exists, right? We don't know where it is. It's missing. But if we look more closely now at Dürer's work, we can see, right, that when we talk about the cross-hatching that we saw with the engraving, that's one thing. You're cutting the lines. But to make the cross-hatching, say underneath the armpit of this skeleton, right, in that little triangle between the pitchfork and his clothing, he's got to carve the little diamonds, right? So if you want it to look like this, what you've got to do is carve the little diamond spaces in between. And if you look at it, it looks as if he drew it. Right? And it looks as if he carved the lines rather than the spaces between them. It's absolutely phenomenal as technique. And again, this is so typical of Northern European art versus Italy. Is this interest in extraordinary detail, right? Meticulousness. That is a tradition going all the way back to the Limburg brothers. Jan van Eyck, Klaus Sluter as a sculptor, had that same interest in refined, tiny details. Now, let's see what we got here. So what's the scene here? I'm going to read something to you from this because this is, I think I'm going to read it to you. The Four Horsemen, right. No, I decided not to read the entire thing. So this is directly out of the book of Revelation. Okay, it comes from the last book of the Bible, where John, St. John, is marooned on the island of Patmos. And he has a series of visions, of dreams, of revelations, right? Revealing what will happen at the end of time when Christ comes back from heaven to welcome the saved and punish the wicked, right? And his revelations show a series of horrific events happening on the earth that basically purged the earth of almost everybody before Christ comes back. Right? End of time being a period of violence, of horror, of unseen cataclysm. And in Revelation chapter 6, he talks about these four horsemen that are sent down from heaven to wipe everybody off of the earth, right? And the first one that comes is plague. And John's book of Revelation says that plague rode on a red horse and carried a sword. No, excuse me, on a white horse and carried a bow and arrow. Got ahead of myself, right? So plague is going to wipe out a fourth of the people on the planet. Plague will be followed by war, who rides a red horse and has a sword. And war will wipe out a fourth of the people on the planet. Then famine, starvation, comes next. Carrying scales, John tells us, and famine will wipe out a fourth of the people on earth. And finally, the fourth horseman is death, and that's who we see over here as a skeletal figure on the right. Who's doing the Bosch picture? Who's working on Bosch, right? There he is there as well, right? We'll see him on Thursday, right? But death comes in on a pale horse. You notice the horse is also emaciated. He's going to wipe up the rest. right? So this is all of mankind being swept aside by the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And part of Durer's message is that no one is safe. So we see down below the hoofs of the horses, we see noblemen and peasants. And even behind death, we see this monster, the mouth of hell, opening up. And whose head is in the mouth of hell but a bishop? No one is safe. It doesn't matter what you do. Death will get us all. That's a pretty gloomy work, isn't it? Right? All end of time, doom and gloom. This was part of a series of prints that Durer did. 14 very large, they're about like this, about 1.5 feet tall. It's over 1 foot tall, 14 inches or so. A series of 14 prints illustrating the book of Revelation. And he has printed text to go with them, just enough to explain the pictures, right? And he issues it in German and in Latin so that anybody could get it and want it and read it. And he issues them in a book with a frontispiece or individually so you could just collect which ones you wanted. Because there's this huge market for these at this particular time. Now, why is that? Around the year 1500, people thought the world was going to end. And the reason they thought this, it was halfway between 1000 and 2000. And the book of Revelation talks about the 1,000-year reign of Christ. So what we see when we look back at history is that at numerous points in history, we see people getting really freaked out about the end of the world. Right around the year 1000. Right around the year 1500. Right around the year 2000. Right? I'm old enough to remember Y2K. We were sure that every computer on the planet was going to freeze up and planes were going to fall from the sky. Right? People's pacemakers were going to explode because of Y2K. We had this sort of secular millenniarism is what we call this. This idea that the world will end at some major anniversary of 1000. And here the 5,000. Right? So Durer is a marketing genius. He knows that people are afraid of the end of the world, and so what does he decide to do? Come up with an illustrated version of the end of the world, right? Of the book of Revelation in 14 collectible prints. Right? Now, another German artist we'll look at and wrap up today, I think, and then move on to Holland on Thursday. Matthias Grunewald, we have this also very gloomy picture down at the National Gallery of a crucifixion. We've seen images of the crucifixion before. This is Christ on the cross, surrounded by his followers. So who's the woman on the left, on the far left? Who would you expect to be there? Mary, the mother of Christ, right? The Virgin Mary. Who's the guy on the right? Who have we seen there before? Got her over here. John, St. John, right? The disciple that Christ loved. Right? Again, look here. We saw them in this work, German work from the beginning of the 15th century, right? So there's the Virgin Mary in the same place on the left, St. John in the same place on the right. Notice the poses are also kind of similar as well, right? Grunewald has turned the Virgin toward Christ, but the hand gestures are the same. Who do you suppose that is at the foot of the cross? Mary Magdalene, exactly right. The other Mary, the follower, the lone female follower of Christ. And she, more often than not, is more emotional. We saw that with Roger van der Weyden, right? And here she is as well, kneeling directly at the foot of the cross. Now, Grunewald's illustration, 100 years later, is more realistic. We see the sun darkening in the background. It looks like an eclipse, total eclipse. The Bible tells us that the sun went dark at the moment of Christ's death. We have a landscape background with houses and huts, right? We can see the stars in the sky. We got rid of that international Gothic gold. And Christ looks more like he's suffering. In fact, this is really kind of hard to look at because Christ's body is so racked with scars. He's been whipped. Right? You know the story of Christ's crucifixion. He's been whipped with a cat o' nine tails. Right? That's where you take the whip and you put pieces of glass and metal and whatnot in it to help tear at the flesh. And Christ's body looks like he's been through it. Those amazing hands that sort of reach up into the sky. Right? Add to this expressiveness. The nails seem to pull at his feet and his hands. Look at especially down at his feet, right? You can see the skin. Yeah, it's gross, isn't it? But the point is that why do you think he does this? Because for you got to understand the sacrifice he made for you, right? And so the point is, hey, it's no easy deal. This one on the left is much more theological. Gathering the blood for the communion, right? But this one is more sort of saying, hey, don't go sinning because look what happened to him because of that, right? It was a painful, realistic experience. To the point where the crossbar even looks as if it's been stretched, like he's been taught in there. If we look back to, I'll give you a second, if we look back to writings in the Middle Ages that tried to get you emotionally engaged with crucifixion, one of them, this is not found in the Bible, right, but we can find it in medieval literature, that the people who fashioned the cross purposely made it too short. And they actually had to stretch Christ to fit the nails so they could torture him that much more. And what Grunewald shows us is how that crossbar has been bent just to get to those hands. But then it also, of course, adds to this idea that he's bearing the weight of the world. He's carrying the sins of mankind at this particular moment, bending the cross. Danielle.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't it also, they started to make it more, like, bloody and, like, dramatic for like, Native Americans to understand?
They did. Oh, my goodness, yes. Especially the Spanish artists that had worked in, but that's much later, right, than this. That's another 150 years after this. But you're absolutely right that the works that were made by the conquistadors and whatnot, who came over from Native American stuff, brought this. There was a really nice show at the National Gallery about that, exactly that issue, about that sense of creepy realism, right? Because it means that whatever you want to say about this work, you don't tend to forget it, right? And I got a couple of details to show you of these different things. Notice even the ripping in John's robe. So there's these little elements that add to this expressiveness of Grunewald's work. Right? Okay. There's this poor body, right, with all of the scars, and you can see that some of the wounds still have pieces stuck in them, right? The crown of thorns on his head has done some pretty serious damage to his forehead. And he looks truly suffering, and he looks truly dead, right? The blue lips, the blood seems to have drained entirely out of him. And the effect is not one of remembering the Eucharist, remembering the communion. What the point of this is, as a small work for private devotion, is that you never forget the suffering of Christ. That was suffered specifically for you. Even those feet, which are rather anatomically strange in their own way, but show the degree that the nail has started to pull through the tarsi of his feet as well. And there is the reaction that we're supposed to have, like Mary Magdalene, who's bawling her eyes out at this particular horror that she's forced to witness. And then the hand against the cross up above, and the stars in the sky as the sun turns dark for a moment. You get the sense that Grunewald had actually probably seen an eclipse and understood how that worked, right? And gives it that natural form. Well, one last thing about him, and then we'll quit. This work by Grunewald, I think, is the only Grunewald in America, anywhere. But it's based almost precisely on an altarpiece he had done. This is in Colmar in eastern France, right on the German border. And at the time he did it, it was part of Germany. And you can see that our body of Christ is incredibly similar to the body of Christ on this altarpiece. But the size is much different. This is an altarpiece. It's huge. Christ is about 7 feet tall here, whereas our work is about 2 feet tall. But if we look at this work, we can see the same sort of horrific treatment of the ravaged body of Christ. We see again Mary Magdalene at the foot of the cross, wailing. We see the Virgin Mary on the left, fainting away into the arms of St. John. And then we see another figure off to the right, with a lamb at his feet. Any guess on who that might be? Ooh, good call, but no. And I said Francis doesn't live until the 1300s or so, right? 1200s, 1300s. And at this point in Germany, he's not as popular as some other as he is in Italy.
St. Agnes?
Agnes is a woman, though,
Oh.
right? He's got a beard. It's John the Baptist. Behold the Lamb of God when he baptizes Christ. And he almost always appears with a lamb. Ghent altarpiece, we saw him. Twice with a lamb. Right? And he's pointing to Christ. Behold the Lamb of God. And he has the little lamb, the symbol of Christ down below, bleeding into a cup as a symbol for Christ. Now this is a problem. This is weird. Why is that weird? Why is it strange to have John the Baptist here? Sorry? He's already dead. He shouldn't be there. He died a year before Christ, 6 months to a year before Christ. He had been beheaded by King Herod. So he has no place here, historically speaking. So we got to ask ourselves, is Grunewald just bad with his Bible? Or does he have a reason for including the Baptist? Right? Let's jump ahead here, right? So there's the Virgin Mary, Mary Magdalene, right? This was an altarpiece for a hospital. Isenheim is the name of a monastery that functioned as a hospital. And they treated skin ailments, skin diseases. And they were set up immediately adjacent to a mineral spring, which is how they treated the skin ailments, right? The altarpiece was placed where everybody in the hospital could see it from their beds while they were being treated. This accounts for why the Baptist is included, right? Because he cures our souls through the application of water, in the same way that the hospital cures our skin through the application of water. Now we'll wrap this up. I have to tell you a little bit more about this background, and then we're going to move on and look at art from the Netherlands in the 16th century. 2 or 3 works there, Bosch and Bruegel in particular, on Thursday. Okay, so I will try and get that last PowerPoint up as soon as I can, maybe tomorrow morning, later tonight, so that you have all the pictures you need as you're studying for the exam, right? Because you don't have this last set yet.